All right. Well, so we can get started on time. I guess I'll go ahead and get started. First, thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. I've been able to make a lot of the other presentations today, and I have just found it really interesting um, how thoughtful the presenters have been and how many of the issues that some of them have raised are they kind of coincide, overlap, or support some of the things that I'd like to share with you today. So, as you can probably see on the slide, hello, I'm Dr. Wendelin Hume. As you might see my background, I grew up in northwestern Ontario, Canada. So that's Lake of the Woods region on the Anishinaabe Reserve up there. Where I am now is not there. I'm actually in the state of North Dakota at the University of North Dakota, hence the UND. So I'm at the University of North Dakota. I'm in the Department of Criminal Justice program here at the university, and I'm also part of the Women and Gender Studies program. And I'm just really pleased to be able to speak with you here today at this wonderful International Criminology Conference. Before we jump into my topic, which is to try to share with you and talk through a little bit a theoretical tribal policy model to help improve or move towards positive peace in an effort to improve the lives of Native Americans here in the United States. But I do think that many of the things that I'll suggest can be definitely applicable for minority individuals in other countries as well. If you're in a country that you feel is not treating the minority population as they should, then I think hopefully some of the ideas behind the model would be applicable for you as well. Before I jump into that, to give a little bit of background, um, I am a First Nations member myself, as I mentioned, from Northwestern Ontario. I currently work on several projects that um, are involved with Indigenous people, right? Either across our nation or here in my state. So, for one, the one that's across the nation, when you get a chance, I encourage you to check it out. It is that one on my left, NIJI, NIJII, stands for National Indigenous Justice, Information, and Inclusion. And our web address is niji.org. And with that one, we bring together a wide variety of Indigenous topics and research projects, working directly with members of the tribes themselves. I think whenever working with minority populations, it is so helpful and important to hear their voice first and foremost. Let them tell you what it is they need help with. Let them inform you of what they know the problems are in their communities. Then, as I heard another presenter just moments ago, like don't wait, like jump in and help. So listen to their voice, let them inform you, but offer your help, right? Like offer your help. So I think we have together a wide variety of scholars working with Indigenous communities to assist them with various justice projects that we've been invited on. The one in the middle, the Be Seen project, this is actually, it started with students at my campus from my tribal justice class. They were part of a national competition to fight domestic terrorism and hate crimes. And one of the things that they came up with was an effort to fight hate crimes against Native Americans. And they thought perhaps one of the best ways to do that was to allow Indigenous culture to be seen, right? And a presenter just moments before was talking about how, like, Black women often feel like they're not seen, not valued, not listened to. Well, Indigenous people have a very similar situation, right? We may know about Indigenous people in terms of like some pilgrim story on Thanksgiving Day, but a lot of people don't know that Indigenous cultures are alive and well at this moment. And that feeling that people don't even know you exist is very isolating, very solitary, very sad, right? And so, in an effort to bridge that gap and help us learn about each other, the students put together a module to help inform people about Indigenous cultures in a respectful way, in the hopes that that would encourage acceptance, support, and allow Indigenous people themselves to be seen, right? By the way, if you want to look at the Be Seen Facebook page, they have a link to the online educational module. It's free. You could certainly take it. I'm sure they'd be happy with that. And then the one finally on the right is the semi-annual statewide opinion survey. And one of the reasons I mentioned that our state here in North Dakota is primarily Caucasian or white, but we do have immigrant populations. We do have a large indigenous population. So we make every effort we can that when we do our statewide survey to be sure those other voices are included as well. Inclusion is what we're all about. So with that, I'd like to move forward. As is typical in my culture anyway, we generally start with a few thank yous. Now, I know that sometimes what happens at many conferences is they will start with a land acknowledgement statement. And it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with a land acknowledgement statement. It's just sometimes the manner in which it is delivered or the manner in which it was crafted um, seems almost kind of like we came, we conquered, now we're here, there, we said it. Um, I would rather switch that up a little bit and do kind of a different kind of acknowledgement. I do want to say thank you, which in Anishinaabe is miigwech. So miigwech, I do want to give a thank you to this space. Um, this space that I'm in right now, North Dakota, it's very flat. It's very different than where I grew up, but it's still beautiful in its own way. And to think of all the many generations of people, Indigenous and otherwise, that have spent time in this space. It's just an honor that I can now be here and share these ideas out with the entire globe, right? It's kind of awe-inspiring. So a really huge thank you. A thank you also, based on my culture, we tend to give a thank you or miigwech to the ancestors, those individuals, those relatives and non-relatives, all the people that have gone before us, that without them, we wouldn't be here communing in this way today. So yes, a big thank you to them. Also a miigwech to the Creator and the spirits that look over us, try to guide us. May I try to stay on the right path as best as I can. And miigwech for looking over us. And yes, also a miigwech to the organizers, to the sponsors, to you, the participants. There's nothing worse than putting all that time and effort into organizing an event and then people don't show up, right? So it is so appreciated that you show up. And in our culture, one of the greatest signs of respect is the ability to listen. And I really appreciate that you're taking the time out of your day to be here today to listen. So thank you. A big miigwech to you. And yes, without my family, I wouldn't be here. So a miigwech to my family as well. Now, what I'm going to share with you today around the tribal model is something of my own design. It is not grant funded. It is not based on that, but it is based on the knowledge of the culture and the people. And that is strengthened by my research in the field, and much of my research is grant funded. So I might as well throw that out there and give acknowledgement to programs like the Office for Victims of Crime and OVC, and also the Department of Homeland Security, trying to lessen hate crimes. We really appreciate their support. And so even though they weren't a part of the crafting of this model, even if they had been, we're supposed to say, these thoughts are my own, right? Don't blame them. So there we go. Now, before we jump into a deeper discussion of my culture and some of the thoughts, the criminological thoughts and theory and policy around that, I think it is important, and I've seen this practiced throughout the conference today. I'm really proud of the participants, the way that questions are posed, like everything has been really respectful. But let me just go ahead and run through it anyway, right? So the idea behind cultural safety is that we try to create a space, like it's a framework that allows us to create a space that is here, at least we are free from racism. At this moment in time, we are free in this space from discrimination. It's a recognition of power imbalances, both historical, and I've seen many presentations that bring that in and draw on that. And I think it's important that we do discuss the history of things. So yes, to recognize that and to also acknowledge at the same time that it's not just a problem of the past. One of the earlier presenters, I need to look at my notes here, she mentioned that we are not in a post-racial society, right? That a lot of people figure like, oh, we're beyond that. Um, Most minority people can give you many examples how, oh no, we're not, right? And the data would support, oh no, we're not. So it is also a contemporary context. The idea of cultural safety is a concept or a framework that goes a little bit beyond some of the other words or types of frameworks maybe that you might be familiar with, like to be sensitive. Sensitivity is nice, it's a starting point, but just to say, oh my bad, I'm sensitive to that. Let's not do that, right? Like we should have it be that it is safe, not just other people are sensitive. It also goes a little bit beyond that we're aware that there's other cultures, they may be different. Moving on. No, we need to really deeply think on that and reflect that, acknowledge that, right? And it even goes beyond, I've had a training, or they're like, I'm culturally competent. To make this feel a safe place for others, it's not enough that one person's culturally competent, right? So cultural safety attempts to embrace the strengths of a wide variety of cultures. And it recognizes, in our case, we're talking about indigenous culture. So it recognizes how these other social determinants outside indigenous culture impact the people's lives within indigenous culture. And if we can approach this topic with a little bit of humility, cultural humility, I think it helps us all listen with an open mind, be able to absorb and analyze the information on a deeper level. In order to do that, we need to put our biases aside. But to put biases aside, we need to acknowledge we have them. And we all do. And so we need to have that little bit of humility. I may think my culture is great, but it is not perfect. And there are some wonderful things about all the other cultures that I've listened to and been exposed to today. And I'm happy to acknowledge that. And I appreciate everybody else who's been sharing today. So let's focus on that idea of having a little bit of humility, right? This idea of learning about cultures, being able to step outside your own and acknowledge other cultures have strengths as well. It's a lifelong journey. It's not a one and done. Been there, done that. We're good now. You need to continually reflect, recognize your own biases, learn new things about other cultures. It's a lifelong journey. And in order to do that, it takes a lot of listening, right? And listening with an open mind, listening without judgment, but really taking it in and being open that there are things we can learn from academicians, from activists, from activist, like all of that, right? There's so much that we can learn from each other. It's wonderful if you can accept that. And so I would just ask that, as I've seen modeled throughout the day, that we continue that we practice that kind of safety framework so that we can present openly and honestly and have a discussion at the end that's open and honest as we present our information. Now, I know this is a lot of words, but one of the things about my culture is it tends to be an oral culture. Much of our history is passed down in our stories, in our songs, right? In our cultural practices. And so I didn't want to overwhelm everybody with a lot of negativity, but I think we do need to kind of understand the elephant in the room. That historical trauma, when we use that term, I don't know about you, but often when I'm in various circles, not this one, other places, when you bring up historical trauma, the general reaction is, oh my word, can you get over it? The very word history means it's in the past. So move beyond it. We're here now. But I think what needs to be understood is that historical trauma doesn't just mean a trauma from the past. It means it started in the past, and unfortunately, it has had these repercussions throughout often generations of people. So, yes, even though that practice or what happened began in the past, it is still felt. It still has repercussions to the people that are here in the present, right? And usually, this is the kind of trauma that is experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. And I've heard several presenters kind of bring up this general notion that these impacts have been felt across generations. I would tend to agree. I know there are critics out there, but in this space of safety, let me make the argument that for an entire group of people, when we look, for instance, at just a few, and this is the condensed list, right? Greatly condensed list of some of the atrocities that have been visited upon Indigenous people inside the shores of the United States, right? The violent colonization. I know a lot of people just say colonization. Let's be honest, it was violent colonization of Native Americans. So widespread that many of the unique cultures, languages, and people, like a species of wildlife, they are extinct. It was genocide. They were wiped out. They no longer exist. You can't bring that back. Now, not all tribal people were wiped out. I have been to conferences, by the way, usually those on the East Coast of the United States. I've found that when I bring up Indigenous issues or topics, that people will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm glad you talked about it, but I was so surprised. I thought all the Indians died. Oh no, many Indigenous people died, but many also survived. Not as many as died, more died than survived. But yes, we still have many different tribes and cultures that did survive. Nevertheless, those that survived did not have it easy either. They faced forced removal from their homelands. This was their home, and then they're told, go west to the Mississippi, go to this area, and we'll leave you alone. And time again, those treaties are broken. People encroached on the lands they gave us, and then were moved again. Often in the dead of winter, you've probably heard of the Trail of Tears. Many people died in these types of forced removals from homelands. Even once you get to an area that maybe they're okay you staying there for a while, there's an allotment process. Like they give you the land, it's your own land. They pretend they give you some land. And if you don't pay taxes on this land that they gave you, they will then turn around and take it away. Parts of it that they want, they will sell to other people. If there's oil, if there's gold, if there's something that they want, they'll come in and they'll take that part. And so it winds up, instead of being kept together as a culture, it's like checkerboard and spread out, and indigenous people of different cultures being jammed together in small spaces. It was not a well thought out or humane plan. To make matters even worse, then they came and took generation of children, often forcibly, away from the parents to put them into boarding schools and religious schools. Many of the youth didn't survive that experience. And for those that did, it was beat out of you. You couldn't speak the language, you couldn't dress, you couldn't practice in ceremonies. You lost your entire culture. They argued, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And so they couldn't kill the children, they would just try to make them not Indian anymore. That was horrible and punishing. And in the land of religious freedom, believe it or not, they punished and outlawed many of our spiritual practices. And it wasn't until not that long ago that by law we could do these practices again. And in fact, it was in 1924, we're now in 2024, so exactly 100 years ago, that Native Americans were finally considered citizens of this great land. These and other inequities continue to exist. The rates of violence, rates of poverty, rates of suicide, poor health conditions, high death rates around birth, short lifespans, just a number of things. It obviously is still an issue. This trauma still continues. I also wanted to mention a little bit more about that concept of invisibility. Just a few facts. So Native Americans, male or female, are more than twice as likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population. Something that's different about the victimization of American Indians is that the violent victimization experienced by Native Americans is typically committed by someone of another race. We often hear as we study criminology, right, that, and when you do profiling, it's usually true. People commit crimes against members of their own race, with one notable exception, and that is Native American victims. Often the violence is interracial at much higher rates, as you can see, than it is for white or for Black victims. And this is true not just for like assaultive types of crimes, it's also true for sexual crimes like rape, that often the assailants are of another race, often that race is white. Another little well-known fact, is that according to CDC data, I mean, ask people on the reservations, they'll tell you what we knew, but let's back it up with data. So according to CDC data, did you know that Native Americans are also more likely to be killed by US police than any other ethnic group? So yes, the violence continues today, not just a thing of history. Here is just a little map I wanted to share to kind of show that, yes, we do still exist, right? Um, the darker blue states are the states that have a higher proportion of the population being indigenous. So, for instance, in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, we have several reservations, and being Native American is one of the most common minority populations. In the states where we are less than 1%, and there are some states that don't have any reservations, I would still let you know if you're out there advocating, you're out there making policy, to be aware that many Indigenous people live off reservation. So just because there's not a reservation in your area doesn't mean that there might not be Indigenous people that could be helped with your services, be acknowledged and be seen, right? I also wanted to do a little bit of comparison of just a few common native ways of looking at things versus kind of the dominant culture way of looking at things. So I just titled it a typical Western way of looking at things. And you can have the whole list there. And I believe I shared my slides so that you could look at this later if you'd like. But I wanted to focus on a couple of things, particularly that notion third down of extended family. Because when we look at the policy towards the end of my presentation, you'll notice that a lot of it is going to focus on collective efforts, community efforts, people coming together, because it, from a cultural perspective, that is the norm. We have people that, we're not even remotely related to, but we call them aunties or we call them uncles, like they're just a part of our family now, right? Um, it goes beyond blood relatives. Uh, you hang out with me enough, you're family, right? We'll take care of other people's children's because maybe one of the parents has run off and the other one's in prison. Like, how can we help? We're family, right? So we often are reaching out and helping. Grandparents are raising children when the parents can't be there. We all work together to try to make it work in order to survive. This has been one of our points of resilience. This has been one of our strengths. And so if you're going to introduce some kind of a policy or a program into our communities, it really has to pay attention to this, or it's not going to be well liked for the members of that community. Extended family, expected, right? It's kind of the norm. When someone goes to the doctor, there's a bunch of us there at the doctor with them. I know doctors don't like it, but get used to it. It's how we roll. So extended family is really important to us, right? I'd also like to point out that notion of looking at humans, the human race, us, as part of nature, as part of the natural environment. It isn't something that exists outside of us. We we grow, we change, we learn from it, and we've always known that we impact it. When we hunt, you're careful. When you harvest crops, if you want to see them in that same place again next year, you're very careful and attentive to how you harvest them. When you're out in the canoe or boat harvesting wild rice, you leave some of that seed for next year. So it'll sprout and we have more rice next year. Like we've always had these practices because the environment of nature, we're only here because it lets us be here. We're appreciative of it and we respect it. And I think that is just so different than many of the actions and the speeches and the policies from the dominant culture. who seems almost surprised at how nature is responding to some of the actions that they've taken. I want to also call attention to, we've kind of mentioned the importance of a group, but let me reiterate that that idea of being a group or a collective, another key difference with that is that we don't pride ourselves on our own individuality or being all braggadocious on ourselves. If anything, our teachings say that the needs of the group, of the family, the department, your student, whoever, like the needs of the group should come before your own. If you're living a good life, you think that way. Let their needs come first. That's a very different way of operating, right? We also tend to have an emphasis on giving. Materialism isn't where it's all at. Um, that's not how you prove you're a good person or an important person. And so we often do giveaways and things like that. Like often at a conference where people are so kind and listening and engaged. What I would do if we were there in person is I would have brought a gift, just a small token, maybe a pen or a pencil or something. Like, here's a gift. Thank you for your time and attention. Like we're always giving. Like, thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for that. Trying to be generous as much as we can. We also, along with being part of the environment, that ties in with our sense of spirituality. We don't necessarily have like established set religions. We have cultural practices, cultural traditions, cultural clans. You know, we do have some of those things, but it's really more, um, it's an essential part of who we are. Our spirituality, it's not separate from us. It's within us and it's how we act and how we interact with each other. It's an essential thing. And so, again, if you find yourself working with tribal individuals, that becomes an important part that you understand that we may give thanks before we eat. We may say thank you at the beginning of our presentation. Like it is just how we live our life. So let us do that and we'll get along a lot better and we'll feel that you understand us and respect us. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, our tradition is often one that is oral. There's a lot of storytelling and a lot of innate knowledge, listening to the signs of nature, to when the geese head south can predict the weather, like just some of those things that are cultural knowledge and understanding, and the stories are passed down, and that's how we learn. So think of it as very kind of qualitative in nature, oftentimes. So here are some thoughts. As we move forward and I present to you my model, I would like you to think a little bit about the notion of how can institutions, whether that's political institutions, government institutions, our scholarly, intellectual institutions, our organizations, you know, those types of things. When we come together doing the things that we do, how can we purposefully set about doing that in a way that we don't just do it the way it's always been done? We don't go down and perpetuate oppression. We go about it in maybe a new way, a higher way. We transcend the systems of oppression so we can create a new and different future, a new way of relating, a new way of sharing, a new way of getting along together in this world, right? And if we can think about that, and I think many of you have, I think the organizers of the conference have, but even as we go about it in our own communities, our own institutions, our own departments, whatever it might be, if we can kind of keep that in the forefront of our mind, what little step can we take and keep taking those steps to kind of overcome the usual ways of doing things that are oppressive What's a new way that we could try? I would encourage us here in the United States to think what kind of Indigenous leaders are needed today and how can we find them? How can we welcome them to come forward? How can we let them know that their work and their voice will be valued? And for those that are listening in from other countries, the same thing with your minority populations. There are leaders and ingenious people within those cultures and populations. What can you help create to find them, nurture them, and allow them, encourage them to come forward? Obviously, if they feel they're not going to be respected or listened to, why would they come forward? But if we can create that space for them, I think that they will, right? And how will our field, whether it's the field of criminology, the field of women's studies, I've heard about the field of economics, computer science, so many different fields represented at the conference. So whatever your field is, how can your field and the whole world try to create a future where members of minority populations, like how can we create it so it looks kind of like an indigenous future? Right now, in many tribal communities, there's very high rates of youth suicide because the youth feel trapped, they feel oppressed, undervalued, invisible, like there is no hope for the future. And if there's no hope, then you might as well end it now. We need to show our youth that there is hope. There's a place for Indigenous people in the future. There's a reason to have an Indigenous future, right? So, what strategies might we put forward? What policies might we present to try to grow this vision of a strong Indigenous future or strong futures across the global community where all of us, majority population, minority populations, we can all come together, all feel valued, and all seek peace, right? So, in that line of thinking, what could we maybe do, right? That's what I wanted to ultimately present to you today. In order to understand this, I think we've already discussed, but in case you wanted it, we all learn differently. Hearing is sometimes useful, reading is sometimes useful. So on the handout that I provided, I did provide some definitions of terms such as racism and colonization. But now I want to kind of weave that into the story as we talk about peace. And in order to understand peace, I guess, we need to understand there's more than one use of that word, right? To me, a helpful framework in looking at it is to understand the difference between the terms negative peace and positive peace. My argument will be that here in the United States today, the Indigenous people are experiencing much more peace than we've had in the past, but it's still not peace in the way that we want it. It is what we would term negative peace. And if I can make my argument and help you understand where I'm coming from with that, I can then posit some ideas how we can continue to move forward to hopefully see a future with positive peace. So, one of the things I want to be sure to point out to people is that within any culture, even though there may be problems, and I've pointed out plenty, the violence, the health, the poverty, I don't want you to walk away going like, oh, those poor Indigenous communities, they are such a mess. There are issues that need to be addressed. This is certain. But there are some wonderful, beautiful strengths within these communities that I don't want to leave you with kind of a tainted view, right? By understanding these communities, we need to understand the struggles they face so that we can understand what kind of help or support we might provide. But at the same time, let's also celebrate and understand they have many strengths, right? To me, they had to have strengths. How else do you survive for all those hundreds of years, the persecution that we have faced, to still be strong and vibrant, have authors and actors and writers and singers, academicians, students, you name it, right? We are a resilient people, and there is something to be said about that. And part of that, I truly believe, comes from that belief in the importance of a strong social network. To be too individual, to have tried to face this one person alone, none of us would have made it. We only made it together. And so that is definitely a strength, I think, of our way of looking at the world and in our communities. And it gives us strong support systems. And because we're open to working together like that, it's going to play a strong role in my model. I think another strength that our culture brings are all the traditions and values that have been handed down since our creation stories, right? And we continue those today and try as best as we can to pass them on to our youth. Yes, we face struggles. There are some languages that are going out of use, right? That we may lose if we don't find a way to preserve them. There are some cultural traditions that youth on social media just aren't interested in listening to grandma tell another story. But if you don't stop and listen to that story, a piece of our culture and history will be lost. So we still face some struggles, but we need to really embrace these strengths of our traditions and values. And there are a number of very good community-based programs and initiatives that are in our tribal communities, that are in the broader surrounding communities that we could join forces together with, right? So we believe in working together as a community. Invite us to join yours, right? And that leads me to something that I think often isn't mentioned, but I hear it in questions. I heard it in some of the other questions too, because people often do. Most people are good at heart and they want to know, what can we do to help? Is there anything we can do? Well, don't tell us what to do. Like, don't just come in and say, here's what you need to do. Yeah, don't do that. Misappropriation is a bad thing. But it's nice that you want to help. So, yes, are there things that people can do to help? And I would say, absolutely yes. Advocacy is key. We need to advocate for ourselves, but we're a very small group. We're a very minority population, right? So our voices would be louder if we had allies. Allyship would be much appreciated, right? So advocacy is when we promote the interests or causes of either like a person, someone, or in the instance of our discussion today, a group, right? A group of people. Now, self advocacy is when you, as a person, speak up for yourself, right? You express your interests, your desires. You insist to hear my needs. Here are my rights, right? And that can be empowering and that can be important, but that's one voice that often is not quite enough. It's a place to start. So start there. But what's stronger is when we can go beyond that, when we can have someone stand right next to us or sit at a monitor around the globe, but be going, yeah, sister, preach, right? Like, tell us. And that's wonderful. When you have people by your side, people that have your back, that idea of allyship, right? Having someone stand beside you, with you, not telling you what to do, but standing right there with you, speaking out with you, advocating for change with you, doing it on behalf of another person or group, being our ally is more powerful than the voice of one, right? And it doesn't just have to be that now there's me and there's one other person by my side or 100 other people by my side. What's even more powerful is if we can get various systems to listen, economic systems, health systems, law and legal systems, academic systems, you name it, right? If we can get system advocacy to say, yes, we need to change our policies. We need to update our laws, update our curriculum, do these types of things. What is it that has unfairly impacted you? What do you suggest we do to change that? And if we can get the powerful groups to also be an ally and advocate and join in these types of changes that I heard many people speak out for on behalf of their groups and their problems that they see in their country. Absolutely, that's what we need is those systems to join us in understanding so we can make these positive changes. Now, the reason that I would say that we don't yet have the kind of peace that I would like to see, I just picked a few examples of some things that go on pretty much all the time, right? One of the things that you may have seen even around the globe that comes from the very state I'm in currently is that idea of DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, where they tried to put an oil pipeline through reservation land, through a water system, and they were going like, go around us, go beneath it, go on farmland, go anywhere but here. But they said, no, this is quicker, shorter, easier, cheaper. We're going through here. Did you know that it wasn't just we didn't want it, but to combat that, they called in the National Guard. They called in all the area law enforcement. They called in the Wagner Group. Yes, the ones from Russia that are also here in the United States. Yes, they called in those independent people and their dogs to stop the protests on native land, right? That's the public at risk as targets for speaking their mind, insisting on their rights, voicing an opinion, and you get violently attacked. That's not peace. We don't feel safe when that's going to be the state reaction, right? There's still racial bias all around us, and not just for Indigenous people, all minorities, right? Big data algorithms, how you do a house loan, how we identify faces and voices, and you name it. It's all biased. That continues and will likely continue. There's very little multicultural training or consistent, concerted efforts to raise awareness about Native Americans still exist in our public school system. There will be a speech or something around Thanksgiving, but a lot of the rest of the curriculum, in some areas, they're changing that. But let's do more and let's not have it just in some areas. Let's all do this, right? Let's let young Native people know other people know you exist and matter. You're not invisible. You don't need to take your life. There is a future for you, right? And when we don't understand other cultures, the easiest thing is to hate them, to blame them, to dismiss them, to be violent towards them. It's so polarizing when we don't take the time to talk with one another, to make that safe space to listen and understand one another. And if it isn't the suicide that frustrates our youth to such desperate measures that they'll take their own life, we see just such large numbers. We call it the reservation to prison pipeline, get the ironic use of that word pipeline, but that's what it is. It's like this direct thing. You grow up, if you manage to survive growing up, you wind up in prison. That's pretty much your options here. That's not a positive, peaceful existence to look forward to. If you say we're terrorists for protesting for our rights to control not having oil in our waters, that kind of thing, like you say, we can't say that, but other people can speak out and spew hate crime information and attack us. That's free speech. It's not fair, right? We need to counter the disinformation, the demonization about those heathens and their barbarous ways and the women that are loose. And yeah, we need to stop that around all minority groups, right? Because anytime we have this kind of rise of extremism, that's a threat to the future we want. That's a threat to bringing about positive peace. We need to act early, act now. We can't wait. It only gets complicated, more complicated, and worse the longer we take with this. And unfortunately, much of this discussion, this understanding, has been missing over the past 200 years. So, high time that we bring it to the forefront now, raise that awareness and see what we can do. So, here's what we can do, or at least my suggestion. I want to make sure we're doing okay on time and be respectful of that. And that's the idea of building on the notion of positive peace. It's a fairly well known theory, lots of writing and groups around it. You can Google it, look it up, what have you. I do want to make one correction on the handout. It didn't make it onto the slide. We see that leg 8 there is blank. And on the handout, I accidentally had a free flow of information twice. If you want to correct your notes, the one that is missing is acceptance of the rights of others. So here are the 8 pillars of positive peace. If a country is at peace with its people, people are at peace with other people, here's what we would see. Sound business environments, free flow of information, high levels of human capital, well-functioning governments, and you can have more than one, and they even kind of talk to each other, work together. They're well-functioning. You have good relations with your neighbors. There's very low levels of corruption. The resources are distributed equitably, and we respect the rights of others, creating a sound business environment, going back around the free flow of information and so on. So these are all positive things we would aim for. And by the examples I just shared with you, I think I'm on fairly solid ground to argue we are not there yet, right? This is a direction we could strive to go towards because we haven't achieved it yet, at least not between the dominant society and government and Indigenous people. So here's my idea of some steps we might take to address this movement towards positive peace. It's based on some of the cultural or spiritual teachings of Indigenous people with different tribes, by the way, different cultures, different languages, different colors on the medicine wheel, and different angles sometimes, but it's always in a circle, always interconnected, always 4 directions. Other than that, there's some variability, but let's go with this model that we see in front of us. So the colors yellow, black, red, and white have significance, meaning, and teachings that I can't get into how deep that is right now. They also represent the 4 directions, like on a compass, right? The 4 directions, east, south, west, and north. We typically start in the east and go around the circle that way. They also represent the stages of life. So like beginning life as a child, growing up as a youth, accepting the responsibilities of being an adult, and sharing your wisdom as an elder and respecting our elders and their wisdom. These are all kind of our cultural teachings. And I think sometimes when you try to present a program or a policy to a community, if you can use their visualizations, use their language and understanding when presenting it, it goes over a lot better because they're like, oh, I get it, right? So that's what I'm attempting to do here. We're going to start in that inner circle with some ideas from the UN and other international groups when they try to create peace between nations or peace between peoples within a nation. They often are looking at these types of things when they do their ranking. How peaceful is a society? Do we see positive peace? And it's many of the things we mentioned, right? So absence of violence, revenue distribution that's accountable. People can participate in their government and decisions. We promote dialogue, that transparency and right to know information, that we're working with nature and managing those natural resources. Um, it irks me just a little bit. I'll let this one off my chest. There was a movement here in my state of North Dakota recently, that there was a group and they were trying to get the tribes in the state together to talk with the Department of like Fisheries and Wildlife, Land Resources, managing natural resources. And they were going to get the tribes together to speak with the people that manage the natural resources because I thought that would be great. Let's listen to them, hear what they want, how they conserve resources in their tribal communities. Maybe we could share and have a discussion. And you know what the state agency said? It's like, we already know what we're doing. We're doing what we're doing. We don't need to talk with them. That's not opening and welcoming. That's not shared management of natural resources. That's not inclusive. And that does not provide us a way that we can tell you what our grievances are and we can discuss how to address those. Like we're just shut out of the room completely. That's not acceptable. What I propose for you to just think about as we wrap it up today is to combine what we have learned on an international scale of trying to promote peace between nations and people. Indigenous people are their own sovereign nations. This idea of how nations can speak to each other, yes, we're within the United States, but we are sovereign nations within the United States. We need to respect that and talk together like nations to nations. And I think the UN ideas and models, along with the model of positive peace, superimposed over these tribal practices and teachings, strengths and sources of resilience could go a long way, right? That if we can talk to each other, not by shutting the door and say, there's nothing you have to offer, we're not listening, we do our own thing. How about you treat us with some respect? How about you allow us voluntarily? We're coming to you. We want to participate. Allow that. Encourage that. Be inclusive. Promote direct participation of the minority people in your country or in your area. Allow those communities to self-design what they want to see, how they want to do this, what they feel is needed, what's in their own best interests, and the best way to approach that. Let them dictate and explain this to the outside society. Which means, yes, we need to be respectful. We need to be flexible in our discussions and how we approach this. We need to try to be inclusive and provide equal opportunities to speak, to share, to suggest policies. We need to respect that some people are perhaps more spiritual than others, and it's not just a thing on a certain day of the week or a certain holiday. Like it is as much a part of us as breathing. And that needs to be understood when you bring policies or programs forward. There are grievances from the past. We're not past that yet. And I think we need to acknowledge that, not dismiss it. We need to speak to it if we're going to have holistic healing. And hopefully we could come together and not vote, not majority rules, but try to reach some kind of compromise or consensus as we work together on improving to have a bright Indigenous future for those of us here now, but especially for our youth and the next 7 generations to come. And with that, I want to say thank you in English, Wado, which is Cherokee, the language of my husband, Miigwech again, a big thank you in my language for Anishinaabe. And with that, I'd like to open it to any questions or discussion.
If you have questions, you can type them in the chat box or the Q&A section. And here is a question from Athena. What kind of cultural policy would you consider more inclusive for Indigenous people? What kind of inclusive measures should be introduced in the Americas?
So I think a lot of it would simply start with, I mean, that's a great question. And ideally, I think you're right. We would want to see like actual cultural policies. I think we would be happy though with just being listened to, being invited to the table. That when we say we have some ideas because we're seeing problems with our waterways, with our fish, with our food sources. So, for those of you managing these wildlife and natural resources in the state, could we talk? And they're going like, no, we don't need to speak with you. So we're not even saying, can you do things our way? We're just saying, can we even just talk with you? We might have some ideas, and they close the door. So we're willing to just even say, invite us to the table, have a two-way conversation with us, maybe listen. We may have some ideas or wisdom we could offer that would help all of us. But thank you for that question.
Okay, I don't see any further question. If you want to contact the speakers, I saw her email was on the list. Okay, there's another question from Avra. How did you get grant funding?
Um, that's a pretty good question. I would say for our projects, one of the things in working with, if you're going after like a tribal related grant, I assume, is kind of the heart of the question. One of the things is to start very early, um, getting to know members of whichever tribe it is you'd like to work with or help, or the minority community you want to work with or help. Um, it takes a little bit of time to develop trust and for people to want to work with you on something like a grant, um, and listen to them about what they feel their problems are and what they think a solution might be, and then go look for grants that would approach it in the way they want it approached. It's very much a participatory design, I think works best. So they can kind of dictate the direction. They can have a say on the model and the research questions you're going to put forward. I think that's what helps build a really strong proposal. And if you're doing any kind of research with, and I'll say with, not about, with tribal communities or other minority communities, having letters of support from those communities, like we know this person, we've worked with this person, we want to do this again. If there's funding, we will be there and we're going to participate. I think that helps make a strong source for an application as well. Beyond that, you can look at some of the nonprofits that offer some grant funding, the foundations and that kind of thing. And many of the government agencies either offer grants and you can tweak them to serve minority populations. But I'm seeing more and more, many of our federal agencies are specifically asking, let's address minority needs and issues. So right now, if you're interested in helping the communities and working on a grant with those communities, I would say it's a very good time to do that. And if you have any specific questions or something, please do feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to discuss it more.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending the International Criminology Conference 2024. So we hope to see you next year again. And bye-bye.
Thank you.